Hello and a very warm welcome. Has the Indian Army been able to stare the dragon in the eye and push the People's Liberation Army back? New satellite pictures from the PangongTso area show the Chinese army has indeed pulled back. Is this a big victory for the Indian Army and the Indian government, or would that be way too premature given the fact that there is now strong infrastructure on the ground and the situation can change within hours if not days? That's my top focus on the Newstrack tonight.
His troops have ensured the Chinese pullback. His troops have stayed mobilized for 10 months. His troops have given their lives, their blood and heart. And now he speaks to India today. The Army's northern commander overseeing the Ladakh pullback. The biggest interview from Ladakh.
You know, on the Newstrack tonight, for the first time, we will be playing out an exclusive India Today interview with India's Northern Army Commander, General Officer Commanding-in-Chief of India's Northern Command, Lieutenant General YK Joshi, a very seasoned military expert with experience during Parakram, before that during Operation Vijay. He's fought enemies on all fronts, in all theaters, and he's the man in charge of having taken on the Chinese army. Remember, we don't want to be too jubilant at this moment because this is a confrontation between two of the world's biggest armies. But is this, at this moment, looking good for India? No one in the world, not just in India but across the world, thought India would be able to stand up against the dragon in the way that we have. Has this ended well? We'll look at that. But most importantly, we will hear from Lieutenant General YK Joshi, India's Northern Army Commander. Our strategic affairs expert and editor Gaurav Sawant is in the 14 Corps area of Leh. He spoke to General Joshi. This is the first time we will be playing out this big interview from the Indian Army General who led the offensive and defensive actions against the People's Liberation Army. That big exclusive coming up in just a moment. What I want to do right at the top of the Newstrack is to show you solid visual evidence of the People's Liberation Army's pullback in the PangongTso area. India Today's open source investigative journalist Ankit Kumar has been able to secure high-resolution satellite images from the north and the south bank of the PangongTso, which is the first visual evidence that we have of the Chinese army actually dismantling the structures that they'd constructed and actually pulling back to Finger 8 and beyond. Here is our lead story tonight, visual evidence of the PLA pulling back.
The Chinese army pullback in the fearsome flashpoint of Ladakh's Pangong. Images released yesterday confirming that the Chinese are disengaging, packing up and moving back. And now, in India Today's second big scoop from Ladakh this week, we show you what it looks like from the air. With jaw-dropping clarity, we show you what the Chinese pack-up really looks like. Take a look at this image from 2 weeks ago at Finger 5 on the banks of the Pangong Lake. You can clearly see Chinese military tents, vehicles and infrastructure. And this is what that location looks like now. With every tent, vehicle and item completely removed, the place left practically whitewashed. Now moving to Finger 6, once again in this image from January 30th, a crowded Chinese encampment with accommodation for soldiers and a possible depot for weapons and vehicles. And here you see now things have been totally cleared out by the Chinese, every bit removed and pulled back. If we zoom out just a little bit, the level of Chinese presence in Finger 6 just 2 weeks ago looked like this. A swarm of tentage, depots, fuel positions and infrastructure. But 2 weeks later, just yesterday, that too has been completely dismantled and moved back beyond Finger 8 as promised by the Chinese. Take a moment and absorb just how much has been moved back from these two before and after images. And here again, in crystal clarity 2 weeks ago, is this permanent position built by the Chinese. No tents here, but proper structures and infrastructure. Possibly a weapons depot and logistics site to fuel the forward areas. But even this apparently permanent position has been dismantled by Chinese bulldozers. You can clearly see the tracks and marks left by earth-moving equipment, as the position has been broken up and moved back. It is important to note that such positions cannot return at short notice.
The images captured by commercial satellite provide the most effective confirmation and validation of the Chinese pullback along the PangongTso at the line of actual control. While the mountains provide many hiding places, there aren't many hiding places from the eyes in the sky. And that is why India is using satellite imagery extensively along with fighter planes, unmanned aerial vehicles and troops on ground to confirm the Chinese pullback as per plan.
And finally, the area between 7 and 8, right before India's own claim line. This is the kind of Chinese presence there was on January the 30th. Permanent defenses and structures in plenty, practically a mini town. But here too, so stringent has been India's demand for a complete pullback in this area that the Chinese have dismantled their structures here as well. 5 sets of images covering the Fingers complex of Ladakh's PangongTso. Images that establish and validate the effect of India's strength in holding China to its commitments. The disengagement may be far from over, but these images suggest a very strong start. With Ankit Kumar in Delhi and Gaurav Sawant in Leh, Ladakh, Bureau Report, India Today.
You know, to talk about the Chinese pullback, I want to go across to Leh, where my colleague Gaurav Sawant interviewed Lieutenant General YK Joshi. General Joshi is the Indian Army's commander who led the offensive and defensive tactical and strategic operations against the People's Liberation Army throughout this period, starting April-May. He was the man who was masterminding the Indian Army's strategy against the People's Liberation Army. If this pullback holds and extends to other sectors, this would be a huge achievement for the Indian Army in the face of an enemy that considers itself the world's new emerging superpower. So here it is, for the first time, exclusive on the India Today network, this big interview with Lieutenant General YK Joshi, the General Officer Commanding-in-Chief, GOC-in-C of the Indian Army's Northern Command.
We decided or mutually agreed that the disengagement will happen in 4 steps. The step 1 would be the disengagement of the armor and the mech on the R2 complex, that is Rangra-Chinla complex. The step 2 would be disengagement on the north and south bank, the infantry that is there. And the step 4, that is the final step, would be the disengagement on the Kailash ranges. It has been agreed that when each step is completed, there will be a verification on the ground. We will confirm to each other that both the armies are satisfied with each other's activities, and only then we will go ahead to the next step. So far, the last couple of days, since 10th of February, it is going absolutely smoothly. The People's Liberation Army has shown very clearly their intent that they want to sort of disengage in the manner, and they have been sort of disengaging in a very smooth manner. Finger 8 is a claim line. We claim our territory till Finger 8. The PLA is moving all its forces behind Finger 8. The entire infrastructure that has come up between Finger 4, that is his claim line, and up to Finger 8, he will be restoring the entire landform. There's a large infrastructure that came up, since he came and occupied in the month of May last year. And that is bunkers, there's a tentage, there are dugouts, there are helipads. Even with those flags on the shoreline in the North Bank, the entire infrastructure will be totally removed. The process has already started, and they will be going back behind finger 8. The third and final thing is that they will not carry out any activity in our claimed areas, whether it is a military activity or a civil activity or any activity will not happen by the PLA this side of finger 8, which is the area claimed by us.
Okay.
Also, we should be very clear that his claim is up to finger 4 and he is not coming up to his claim line. So as far as I am concerned, it is an absolutely win-win situation for us. Prior to 29th and 30th of August, 5 core commander level flag meetings had been held and we were going nowhere. So I got directions from my chief that we need to, create some leverage so that then we can exert pressure on the PLA and then, get the negotiations into a favorable position. And once these operations were, conducted, we were able to totally surprise the PLA on the Razangra-Chinla complex, on the south bank, and even on the north bank, where we occupied areas which are dominating the entire PLA deployment on the area of finger 4 and in the area behind finger 4 as well, right up to finger 8. He did not expect it.
He didn't expect it
He
at all.
was totally surprised, and his OODA loop, what we call, the observe, orient, direct, and sort of act, was, went into haywire. Initially we launched on the south bank. While he was reacting to that, we launched on the Razangra-Chinla complex. Thereafter, when he was reacting to that, the same night, on the night of 30th, we launched the operation on the north bank of PangongTso. And even, the further north 2 passes of Kiula and Nila went unoccupied. So he actually did not know what was happening and was totally surprised. Once we launched the, quid pro quo actions and we went and occupied Razangra-Chinla, the amount of armor and mechanized forces moved on the ridgeline. And then, the PLA reacted once they got the OODA cycle right. And then when their armor was sort of moving up and we had our red lines, absolutely clearly drawn, that was the time the moment was very, very tense. Balloon could have gone up any time. And it is the maturity, actually, of the Indian Army, the soldier who's sitting on the ground, with his rocket launcher and the tank man with his, gunner and the crosshairs, he sees the adversary's tank coming up, close to him. The easiest thing he has to do is press the trigger and open fire, which is a no-brainer, that is what we're taught in our training institutions, But to not press the trigger is what requires courage and maturity and grit and determination, And that is a time when we were able to stop him, without sort of opening fire. We conveyed it to him absolutely clear that we will not allow the change or not allow the change in the status quo along the LAC, in the manner that he was wanting to do. That will not happen. He understood that. So ideally he should not attempt any such misadventure again. He's understood that this was a strategic miscalculation on his part.
So that's a big India Today national exclusive. The man who led the Indian Army's Northern Command talking about this huge Chinese pullback. Just how big a debacle is this for the People's Liberation Army? How big a victory is this for the Indian Army? Or is it time just to pause and wait and watch and not declare victory just yet? For differing perspectives on this, I'm joined live on India Today Newstrack at this time by our Strategic Affairs editor, Gaurav Sawant. He's the one who got that big scoop. Gaurav, congratulations. General Joshi is one person everybody's been wanting to speak to. He was a hero in the Kargil war, and if this truce holds and if this pullback holds, this will be a huge achievement for the Indian Army. With us also on this broadcast for a completely differing perspective is a man who's been a strong critic of the government's actions and some of at least the initial part of the Indian Army's actions as well. Military scholar and veteran Colonel Ajay Shukla, for a perspective on how the rest of the world and especially the United States is seeing this face-off between these Asian giants. I have Vipin Narang, one of the top nuclear policy strategic affairs experts, joining us from Washington DC. a man who's led the 14 Corps of the Indian Army, which is the theatre of command where these operations took place, and is a huge military hero himself. General Kulkarni joins us on this broadcast as well. Many military exploits to his credit, and he can talk about what this will mean if, and remember I keep using the word if because this is a confrontation between two of the world's largest armies and things can change. So we really need to pause, reflect and not be too jubilant. And for a perspective from Beijing, we have NR Tenjing, who has a good sense of what's happening in the minds of those who run China. I want to go across first to Gaurav Sawant because he's had some exclusive access, traveling across 14 Corps, speaking to officers on the ground, traveling to border areas as well. How confident is the Indian Army at this moment that this pullback will hold, will actually extend to other sectors like Depsang, Demchok, areas where there's still a confrontation? And I caught in that interview this very interesting piece, and I hope everyone who's listening picked on to that as well, that General Joshi spoke of having gone on the northern bank of the PangongTso above the Chinese still finger 8. He actually said that we were sitting on the Chinese head on finger 8. So the scale and scope of what went on at the end of August and early September, way beyond what anyone had reported so far. So Gaurav, congratulations. Give me your best sense of how confident is the Indian Army that this pullback will hold and extend to other areas?
Thank you, Rahul. The army is extremely confident. They were on top of the OODA loop post 29th and 30th of September, because look at the multi-pronged strategy that was adopted. South PangongTso, Rizangla, Richinla having your tanks there, North PangongTso and certain other heights where the army continues to dominate, and that's a little a different area. So the army is very confident. There have also been 9 rounds of talks. The Chinese Spring Festival is coming. Perhaps that also explains the speed with which the Chinese soldiers were disengaging, wanting to go home for the Spring Festival. Will they come back? Remains a big issue. But when they come back, they'll find a much better prepared and deployed army on ground. So one message that the army's been able to send across, and remember, Rahul, India Today is the only channel to have also travelled all the way up to the Daulat Beg oldie of last outpost at Karakoram at the height of the standoff soon after Galwan. So we have massive deployment in this entire area. You heard General Joshi himself say that there is no massive standoff, no troops amassed at Depsang. Yes, there are differing perceptions. Their patrols come and stop us. Our patrols go and stop them. Their strengths, we have the numbers, the strengths that are on ground today. They can be built up, but then they can be built up on both sides. What will it achieve? What's the end game? Do the Chinese now want to, escalate this, or do they want to sort it out? All of these issues, the army says whatever they may want to do, both sides are prepared and both sides have the initiative along the LAC, Rahul.
General Kulkarni, what Gaurav's interview with General Joshi does is answer to all those who are wondering kuch kar rahe hain, nahi kar rahe hain, kitna kar rahe hain. The scale and scope of India's counter operations is not just on the northern banks of the Pangong. It's not just on the southern banks of the Pangong, it's also on the northern banks and going not just above Finger 4 where we thought the Indian Army was, but actually going all the way sitting on their heads on Finger 8. That is a huge operation, which in the manner that General Joshi described it, I had goosebumps just imagining what would have gone on that night where you had all these young boys scaling those troops and sitting on the dragon's tail.
Rahul, what you are saying is absolutely right. It's not so easy. Imagine fighting at heights which are beyond 18,000 feet. Is it easy? And especially now when the winter is at its peak, blizzardous weather, absolutely blizzardous weather. It's extremely difficult to breathe, difficult to eat, difficult to sleep. And under these circumstances, what the troops have done is extremely commendable. And it is for that reason that you realize that the Chinese have accepted disengagement. This disengagement is mutually acceptable, and the Chinese have realized that it's not worth unnecessarily to fight it out to a place where they're not likely to win at all. Let us not see all of it in terms of victory or defeat. It's a first step towards normalcy to be restored for peace and tranquility in eastern Ladakh. I think that is how I see it, because it's mutual. Mutually, both the countries have accepted. After all, we are the two of the largest armies in the world. And so let's not narrow it down who's victory, who's defeat. No, it's restoration of normalcy. In that context, I see it's a huge, big win for both the sides. Because obviously the Chinese have pulled back with the view that they don't want to confront the Indian troops. The Indian troops have shown that they can stare into the eyes of the Chinese and won't let them do what they intended to do. That itself is a big thing. I think in step one, I would say, way we have gone about it, definitely it's what
you're being you're looking at it from a military perspective and very naturally not wanting to declare this a victory, but the fact is when you're up against a supposed emerging superpower and you're able to enforce a stalemate and force him back, that for a country like India up against a country like China at their stages of development is a huge military victory. I want to go across to Colonel Ajay Shukla because he's had a certain perspective on the government's actions, the Indian Army's actions, found them slow, not moving fast enough, at least in the initial period when this got reported. Now you've just heard from General Joshi the scale of the Indian Army's operations, not just in the north and the southern bank, but going all the way up till Finger 8, sitting on the heights above where the Chinese were. What are you making, Colonel Shukla, about the manner in which the PLA has pulled back at this time and the kind of disengagement that's taking place? Colonel Shukla.
Rahul, first of all, I would like to impose a measure of caution on this breastbeating that seems to be taking place about a great Indian victory. We don't quite know yet what exactly the disengagement involves, who all have disengaged from where, what is happening in sectors like Depsang and Gogra Hot Springs. So while it is laudable and I think it's very welcome that both sides have pulled back in PangongTso and come back from the brink of open fighting, I think we need to have a measure of caution on what exactly the larger picture is. I would also like to point out here that you're saying that I've had a different viewpoint. I had a different viewpoint at the point when the government and the military were trying to make out that the Chinese have not entered Indian territory, that there is nothing happening on the border, that things are hunky-dory. At that stage, I was reporting that no, it's not the case. There is indeed a serious problem. But starting from early August, when the Indian troops, in a preemptive action, in an excellent preemptive action, in a very brave preemptive action, captured the heights of the south bank of PangongTso, the balance of let's say the balance of victory and defeat shifted in favor of the Indian side, because now we were in possession of a certain set of heights that the Chinese wanted. That is what has translated into this pullback. But again, I will impose a measure of caution and say that let's see what happens in Depsang, let's see what happens in Gogra Hot Springs. So far, so good. It's good that we've pulled back. It's good that there's no open fighting on the brink of open fighting. But let's not declare victory just yet.
Vipin Narang, sitting where you are in Boston, what do you make of the way this is playing itself out? Would you share the contention that when a country like India is up against a country like China that thinks it's taking on the United States and actually ends up in this fight and ultimately needs to realize that this is a stalemate, they can't win, they can't push the Indian army over and have to pull back, that would, in some senses, even if we don't want to beat our chest very much, be considered internationally as a big Indian victory?
Hi, Rahul. Thanks for having me. I think the last couple of days we've been seeing the footage and the pictures of the scale of the Chinese deployment at PangongTso and the South Bank, and 200 armored pieces. I mean, this was the sheer scale of the deployment, I think, has surprised a lot of Western scholars and analysts. But I think General Joshi's remarks also indicate the scale of the Indian counter deployment, and we haven't seen a lot of pictures of that in the public domain. And the description, of the 29th, 30th operation is really impressive. To take the heights in the Kailash range, and then on the same time take the heights on the Pangong on the north bank, and confuse the Chinese in order to gain that tactical advantage is really impressive. And we have to assume that the Indian deployment is roughly, of the same scale as the Chinese deployment. And so the good news is pulling these forces back at this point and reducing the potential for the friction to heat up in the Pangong sector is really, really important. And the other sectors will have to come later, there's no question. But, the note of caution that I think is important is we have to see what happens in the next couple of months. Pulling these forces back for the Chinese at the height of February, as General Kulkarni said, I mean, the harsh conditions and the heights make it very difficult to sustain this kind of footprint. So we have to see whether they go back permanently or whether this is just a temporary withdrawal. I think best case scenario, we know that these forces are not going back to Beijing, right? I mean, the Chinese have built up this infrastructure in the sector and in the theater to potentially surge back at any moment. And so, the worst case scenario is that they come back and that this persists once the spring and the summer returns. But even the best case scenario, I think, is a problem for India strategically in the long run, which is that Chinese buildup of the infrastructure and deployment of these forces now forces India and the army to do the same on its side in order to prevent a repeat of May 2020. And so in the long run, this really changes the Indian Army strategy, which was largely focused on the Western sector with Pakistan. And now a lot of the army...
But I can counter-argue to say that without getting into a war or a prolonged confrontation, the Chinese have signaled their intent. They've given you advance warning that their designs are nefarious and that India better guard up. So it's good in that sense that we knew their nefarious designs, that they've been exposed, and now the Indian army realizes that Pakistan is actually just a very small threat. You don't need to worry much about Pakistan. They're in a mess of their own making. It's China who's a real enemy, and we need to watch out and build our capacities as well. I want to go across to Ainar Tenjin at this moment. How are you reading this pullback from the People's Liberation Army? From what I'm picking up from our sources in the Northern Army Command, there's a big Chinese festival, and the PLA was pretty keen on going back home, Ainar Tenjin.
Well, just to be clear, the festival will be over tomorrow. The 18th is the last day. There will be a lantern festival later on, but the days for going home for spring break, for the spring festival, are essentially over. So this idea that this was somehow motivated by that is not correct. In terms of this, I think it's positive for both sides. Beijing obviously would not agree to something that they didn't like. You're seeing a pullback on both sides. I know that everybody wants to, inject some sort of dark theory into this, but I think sometimes, a spade is a spade, and what you have here is two sides coming back. It's a little disappointing that it's not comprehensive, but as the interview you had with the general indicated, this is about trust building. Both sides need to know that the other side will respect the agreements that have been made. And I see this more as political than military. I know everyone's been talking about that, but when you have these situations, pulling apart militaries is like pulling apart double-sided sticky tape. It takes a little bit of a little while, and both sides need to feel that they somehow carried the day.
I want to spend a moment playing devil's advocate, and I want to ask General Kulkarni about, whether we gave up the leverage that we had. Gaurav asked that question, to General Joshi, that we were sitting on top of South Bank, and with what we've done, we've given up our leverage. The Chinese are still ahead of where they were earlier in Gogra, Hot Springs, Depsang, some places in Demchok. What if they don't go back? So whatever military leverage the Indian Army had, we've now given up. You're stuck with them still on areas where you used to patrol earlier. What if they say, okay, we got what we want and now we're not giving? So it'll be 2 steps in front and only 1 step back.
Rahul, let's not see it that way. I would rather say that this is the step 1. If we have accepted, and we've been saying from day 1 that we want status quo ante April 2020, and in that context, North and South PangongTso Lake is being taken care of. And when we see the leverage part, in any case, all along, we were sitting hunky-dory on heights. There was no problem at all. But when we have decided, if there's a mutually agreed upon status quo ante April 2020, and the Chinese have also started showing their good intent of demolishing and ensuring that landforms are back to square one as that existed in April 2020, by demolishing the jetties, helipads, pillboxes, bunkers, observation posts, pulling back the communication line. All that is being seen by satellite pictures and also through your picture. So let's see. But as I said, each and every time, this pause must not lull anyone into complacency. Vigilance has to be there. We will have to be alert. all of it, if it translates into the resolution of the border problem, and that's what it should be. But if it is just a pause, if it's just with a view to pull back, or maybe what you just said, the Spring Festival or the centenary celebrations of July, it cannot be a smoke screen. We have to be careful. We have to be vigilant. We will remain as alert as we can be unless the border problem is resolved. Having said that, in phase one, if North and South PangongTso can be resolved in the similar electricity, if we can expect it in Hot Spring, Gogra, Depsang, then we could probably feel
Colonel
that the
Shukla,
Chinese...
what's your reading of the situation? Why are you so concerned about Chinese deployment in Depsang, Gogra, Hot Springs, Demchok? Explain that to our viewers. Why we shouldn't be over jubilant just at this moment. What's happened is fantastic, but why we need to just hold the bubbly, as it were, and not get carried away at this moment? Colonel Shukla.
That's a very good question, Rahul. First of all, just to go back to your last question to General Kulkarni, this deployment or this withdrawal from the south bank of PangongTso, we don't really know what the quid pro quo was. It's not as simple as it appears to be that, we pulled out from the south bank to encourage the Chinese to pull out from the north bank. We had excellent positions. We had a position that has changed the dynamics of this entire conflict. So to get the Chinese to pull back, I think we would have got more out of them than we actually appear to have got. I think there is some dimension to this that is not being communicated publicly as yet, and probably for very good reasons. But coming to your question, which you've posed to me, why is Depsang important? Why is Galwan important? Why are Gogra Hot Spring important? The post at Daulat Beg Oldi and the sort of Depsang plain are the northern tip of India. They are the tip that connects to over the Karakoram Pass to the Chinese provinces in Xinjiang. They have a connection to the Chinese sort of territory that Pakistan ceded to them, the Shaksgam Valley. There is an element of connect to, not directly, not as much as is made out, but still there is an element of connect to the Siachen Glacier sector. And therefore, it is very important for India to retain a strong presence in Depsang and to prevent China from coming and making encroachments into that area. I'm sure that there will be negotiations that take place for that as well. But right now, we don't appear to have had any negotiations. China still appears to being able to sort of prevent Indian posts or Indian patrols from going to PPs 10 to PPs 13. And that's a matter of some concern. Galwan also is a matter of some concern because it is possible that the Chinese can re-enter. They can sort of interdict the road that goes along the Shok River to Depsang. So I think there is a lot of speculation.
So, Gaurav, I was reading some Chinese commentary where their scholars and military analysts were saying, don't think of this as a victory. We've built up infrastructure. We can be back. I mean, it's just a exaggeration, but he said we can be back in an hour. And therefore, even if we're pulling back, we've laid a foundation which allows us to come back. It will take India much longer to deploy because you don't have similar infrastructure at this moment. We're trying to fix that, but at this moment, you don't have similar infrastructure. So therefore, what's your information about Gogra, Hot Springs, Depsang, Demchok, the other sectors where the Chinese have come in and now need to pull back?
So Rahul, absolutely right. China has better infrastructure, but India's fast building infrastructure. The fact remains, in the past 7 months, more infrastructure has been created along the LAC than had been done in the past 10 years. And the question remains, why wasn't it done earlier? It's happening now. Bridges are being built, roads are being built, alternate access is being built. And it's not as if, Colonel Shukla talked about Siachen. I've driven on that road all the way from DBO to Siachen. It takes 40 minutes to fly. It took us a day and a half by road to get there. So it's not as if the Chinese will just come driving and they'll get to Siachen Glacier. I've driven on that road. Point one. Point two, we have massive forces deployed in this area. We are not fighting defensive, as you've seen post 29th and 30th of August. There are many aces up India's sleeve. This is not the India of 1962. This is not the India that is, doing penny packet deployment at forward locations and not looking after the entire entire supply chain. So if China has certain ways that they may want to interdict us, there are ways that India can also play the same game, should China want to play that game. And that message has been sent out very unambiguously by this action of 29th, 30th and subsequently. There are some subsequent actions, as Colonel Shukla rightly pointed out. Not every bit is in public domain just as yet, but gradually when it comes out in public domain, we will have reason to be proud of our army. We will have reason to be proud of the whole of the Government of India approach, whether it's Defense Ministry, Foreign Affairs Ministry, Prime Minister's office, the people of our country saying no to Chinese goods. All of that has had an impact and will continue to have an impact on ground.
Professor Narang, there was an exchange between America's new President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping. How are you seeing the relationship between Washington DC and Beijing change and evolve over what we saw over the last 4 years under President Trump, and how does that impact India's relationship with Beijing and how Beijing perceives New Delhi?
Yeah, good question, Rahul. Surprisingly, I think you'll see a lot of continuity actually between the Trump administration's approach to China and the Biden administration's tendencies. I think there was a concern that the Biden administration would try to revert back to some of the more cooperative elements of the Obama administration with China. But I think the last 4 years have changed that. And, one advantage, I think, is the Biden administration has just a higher level of competence in its Asia policy appointments. And so, we may see a much more effective attempt to confront China at these friction points. I mean, look at Chinese behavior across its eastern flank, western flank has been exceptionally aggressive over the past year. And the U.S. is well aware of that with eyes wide open. And so I think the focus on the Indo-Pacific is not just rhetoric. There is a lot of effort to redeploy and reorient American national security strategy towards the Indo-Pacific, and India is a big part of that. And one big piece of this, we hope, is that the Indian military will be able to participate, especially the Navy and the Air Force, and not just the Army, in a broader China strategy.
And Tenjin, the one question the mandarins in Beijing will need to confront is, what did China get out of this entire operation? If they've pulled back, as they have now reportedly from Finger 4 to Finger 8 after having come in, if India sat on their heads on top of Finger 8 in Rezangla, Rechinla, in the south bank of PangongTso and other areas which Gaurav and General Joshi don't want to talk about, and if the Chinese had to turn their tanks back and go home, then what was the purpose of this mess? China talks of shared prosperity for people of Asia. That's the right approach. You've lost a friend. The Indian Prime Minister was personally keen on engaging with the President of China, the people of China. He's been a long-standing advocate of India-China relations. All that's in the history bin now. Your apps are being banned. Your companies can't invest in one of the fastest-growing markets in the world. It's said that Chinese strategists are really wise, but in this case, there's a lot of mango souffle on their face that the mandarins have ended up with.
Well, quite frankly, I do think it's a shame that India and China don't get along better. But from Beijing's point of view, what happened in Jammu and Kashmir, not internally, but in terms of redrawing maps, the statement by a senior minister in the Lok Sabha saying that he would not rest until he got lands that are held by China back. And, the infrastructure building made China, aware that maybe something was going to happen. So from China's point of view, all they wanted to do was show resolve, that they will not be pushed around, that their territories are not up for grabs. They don't want a repeat of 1962. And they simply want to go forward. In terms of goodwill, India had the opportunity to join RCEP for political reasons. It didn't. But this is not a situation where China is always the bad guy. I would respond to my fellow American that from China's perspective, they're defending their shores and their territory from freedom of navigation patrols by the United States, who is not a signatory to the UN Convention of Laws of the Seas, but sees itself as the policeman for that. These are unilateral actions by the U.S., and these are the types of things that concern Beijing. They do not want to appear weak. They do not want to think that people to think that the U.S. or any country can walk into its territory. It's been very clear about that in the North Korean, South Korean war. also in other points.
So here's what I wish to say in conclusion. There were people in the Indian government, there were generals in the Indian army who thought that Pakistan was the real enemy and that China was a friend and that we could engage with China and somehow both countries could prosper mutually. What the last 1 year has shown to the Ministry of External Affairs, to the Prime Minister's office, to the Indian government is that Pakistan is the sideshow. The real enemy lies across the Himalayan ranges, and that is where we need to build our capacities. Beijing has a head start. I was speaking to one of the senior most ministers in this government just over the weekend, and he said that when it comes to defending our land, it's like having a thief who's jumped into your house and you're looking around, and how can you accept that? It doesn't matter what your capacity is, what his capacity is. You will do what you can, you will throw what you have, and you will push him back, which is what the Indian government has done. It's a warning. It's a warning of sorts that you cannot think of China as a friend because Beijing is not friendly towards you. They want to rule the world, they want to rule it alone. India needs to develop capacities. It's a warning. India now needs to act on that warning. And my big fear is, if these tanks all pull back, will we go back into a comfort zone that we haven't been militarizing and modernizing our army in the way that we should? Will we go back into a chalta hai zone? I hope we don't, because that's the biggest mistake we can make. But just imagine that night when you had troops, young boys of the Indian army, climbing up the Kailash ranges, Rechinla, Rizangla. I've traveled in some of those areas. Those heights, those mountains are steep can be. And not just that, even in the northern bank, across the PangongTso, going not just up the heights of Finger 4, going behind the heads of the Chinese on Finger 8. I hope one day Gaurav, Shiva, one of our colleagues, writes a book on what went down that night, because it will make for an absolutely fascinating raid. What a military operation that would have been. But as Colonel Shukla said, and I take him seriously when he says, don't get overexcited just yet, because they still need to pull back from multiple areas. And the more you keep saying, it's a victory, it's a victory, it's a victory, the more you irk the enemy. He's your enemy, make no mistake, but don't irk him, because this war is not to our advantage. And now China knows not to his as well. At the end of this broadcast, I just want to salute General Joshi and the entire Indian Army for the effort that they've made over the past several months. It is unimaginably cold at this time. I've spent a couple of nights on Tiger Hill and Tololing. You can't sleep. Someone like me, you just can't sleep. Gaurav's been there at this moment. It is miserably, insufferably cold. To have been up there in their tents, in those small hutments that have been created, staring this so-called supposed superpower, staring him in the eye, pushing the dragon back, forcing their tanks to go back, is indeed a huge signal of intent. General Joshi and everybody else, we salute what you've done. Thank you so much for your service and your effort, your valor, your bravery. You do us proud. We slip into a break. I'll have more for you on the other side. Stay with us.